Welcome back to the Bring the Juice podcast. On with me now, special guest from the fan in Indianapolis, Kevin Bowen. Kevin, how are you doing?
Doing great, Cody. Thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we were talking off air a little bit. You were at that Pacer game last night, man. Just talk to me a little bit before we get into the subject we want to talk about today. Talk about that crowd and that environment, man, with Victor Oladipo's return.
Late January Wednesday games against the team outside of the playoff race, they don't garner a whole lot of environment or a high level of an atmosphere. But that game last night felt like a playoff game, and just the anticipation of seeing Victor Oladipo come back. And I felt like every time he shot it, you just had this kind of, big gasp from the crowd, just almost pleading for the ball to go in because they wanted a reason to erupt, and knowing that their best player was back from such a horrific injury. And then for him to hit the shot that he did with, less than 15 seconds to go, it was a pretty good script for Victor Oladipo in his first game back. And it'll be a fun, final 3-ish months of the season for the Pacers, just to see this group that's overachieved so far continue to mesh now that their best player is back and healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other Indianapolis team that you cover, Kevin, the Colts, you've been kind of pretty vocal about your opinion on, just the whole idea of, Chris Ballard and his first couple of years here as GM, kind of how he's approached free agency, and also, how much pressure, I guess, before we start on that, kind of talking about how much pressure, it puts on Ballard and company to hit on those draft picks, because, I mean, they're not really, when you think of those top free agents in the last couple of years, I mean, beyond Justin Houston, and you could maybe throw Devin Funchess in there potentially, the Colts really have not been there as far as like trying to bring in and I guess signing and bringing in some of those players, some of the key players that you think, oh, this guy could go to the Colts. But, I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit today, Kevin, about that free agency approach. And, the last couple of years, obviously, Chris Ballard outside of 2017, he's had Andrew Luck, or at least in his mind, had Andrew Luck as his starting quarterback. And now this is the first year that Chris Ballard, in Chris Ballard's tenure, that, there's really no possibility that he has Andrew Luck for the next season. And so I kind of want to talk about his free agency approach and your kind of thoughts on, should it change, and why do you think it should change or not change?
Yeah, I think it, and I've mentioned this several times, but I think it should change. I understand where Chris Ballard's coming from, and I do believe, when you're talking about your core, and especially kind of, the top 5 or 10 players on your roster, when the majority of those guys can come from the draft, that is great. That's great for, building team chemistry, culture, letting those guys grow together, kind of rewarding your own. If guys have success in your own, building and in your own environment, I think they're naturally going to be inclined to want to re-sign with you and enjoy their time in whatever city that you're in. So I understand that. But at the same time, I think in today's NFL, using free agency as another way to build your roster, not as big of a way as the draft, but again, as a way that, maybe a little bit more than just supplements your roster. I think that's a route that you've seen virtually every team get to the Super Bowl go ahead and use. And the Colts just have not used free agency to the degree that I think they should have, here, especially I would say mostly over the last 2 off seasons. That first off season for Ballard, I mean, he signed over 10 free agents. I mean, it was a total overhaul of what he did, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. But the last 2 years, it just hasn't been to that degree. And I know last year, I mean, they were involved with C.J. Mosley and Landon Collins and looked into those things, but, did not want to go ahead and follow through on that. And like you said, sign Devin Funchess, sign Justin Houston. But I still thought there was an opportunity to maybe get another name or two into your building. And I think Ballard admitted after the offseason, a bit of, he didn't say he regretted his lack of activity in free agency, but when you hear him say, there wasn't enough depth on the roster and I take blame for that, and we didn't have enough veteran leadership, and he singles out, Mike Mitchell and Al Woods, 2 free agents that he did not bring back, that to me obviously indicates that they didn't do enough on the open market given the cap space that they had. And now if you look at this offseason, you don't have the quarterback under contract for a mega deal. If you look at total resources, outside of the, Miami Dolphins, no team has, better resources and cap space and draft picks than the Colts. So, I think they will spend a little bit more in free agency, and I think it's needed to try to get this roster back to being at a, really kind of at a top 8 level, which I don't even think it was at last year, even when they made the final 8. Thought they overachieved a little bit last year, and down the stretch, the schedule got a bit favorable for them, and still winning 9 of 10 or whatever it ended up being is was a tremendous feat. But I don't think we ever looked at last year's roster and thought, maybe with luck, yeah, but I think he covered up still a lot of it from the standpoint that I just didn't feel like last year's roster was a final 8 sort of playoff caliber roster.
Yeah, and speaking of, there's a couple points I wanted to touch on, but speaking of, Ballard talking about the veteran leadership, where do you kind of stand, Kevin, on the whole veteran leadership versus talent level? Because he's mentioning these guys, Mike Mitchell, Al Woods. None of these guys. Al Woods. Mike Mitchell. He had the defensive player of the week 1 week, but Al Woods got benched. So, where do you stand on the whole talent versus leadership kind of thing? And what do you think the Colts should do when they're trying to figure out that balance if they bring in some free agents this offseason?
Well, I think it's a great question. And like you said, Al Woods is benched, and when you're healthy at safety, Mike Mitchell wasn't really on the field much. So there is a balance. I also think there's the ability to, if you can get a higher end talent, that player can naturally lead a little bit with just how good of a player he is. I think Justin Houston is one of those guys. I don't think he's a very vocal leader. I know that he breaks down the huddle pre-games and things like that, but I just don't think he's a very boisterous sort of voice. But at the end of the day, the guy's track record from a Pro Bowler is pretty proven, and he's a double-digit sack guy, and I think that leads in that room with a lot of young faces that need to be developed. So, I'm not looking at, just spending money strictly to get leaders in your building, because I do think there's a fine line between too much culture and not enough talent. So you have to find that balance, certainly. But when you have $95 million and you look at the offseason, the Costanzo domino could very well, take a chunk of that money. But outside of that, there's not one free agent on that list that you look at as a must resign. You can make cases, I think, on both sides of it for, probably the next 5 or 6 names on that free agent list. It's something I've written about on 1075thefan.com. And then you get into extensions, and, Ryan Kelly probably deserves a new one. Marlon Mack, I think, deserves a new one. Outside of those 2 names, I don't think you're standing on a table really for anybody else. So what I'm getting at is the $95 million, let's say $30 million goes to Costanzo / extension, maybe 40-ish goes to Costanzo, extensions, and maybe a free agent or 2. And that still leaves a ton of money to go ahead and spend on the open market. And in my mind, there are some really, really good fits, especially along the defensive line, that I think the Colts would be wise to look into in free agency.
Yeah, and you just mentioned that's kind of segues into my next question here for you, Kevin. You kind of mentioned some of those names that you think would be good potential fits for the Colts in free agency. Obviously the Colts, they have the draft capital to draft some positions of need, but you can also supplement that in free agency. And you mentioned some of these players. Who are some of those high-end, I guess, positions? And then if you have some certain players who you think would be good fits for the Colts in free agency.
Well, I guess let's just start with quarterback. I'm not that gung-ho on finding a quarterback in free agency. I'm kind of more of a team draft a quarterback. So I cross that off the list. Running back, I don't think needs to be used either. When you look at wideout, I think Amari Cooper is probably the biggest name. I know Emmanuel Sanders is on the open market, a little bit older for me there. I know AJ Green's been a name thrown around a little bit. You definitely worry about the injury situation, but, he might be a name at least to look into, but that's a little bit more of a stopgap considering I think he's definitely over the age of 30. I want to say he's like around 32 years old. And then, of course, what's your domino going to be with a guy like Devin Funchess? That's a guy that I felt like internally the Colts could bring back. Does Funchess want to come back is probably another question. Robbie Anderson from the Jets, it's kind of always been this bit of an intriguing talent that, do teams kind of fully believe in? Do the Jets fully believe in him as inconsistent quarterback play? There in New York held him back. From a tight end standpoint, I know Hunter Henry has kind of been a popular name thrown around there. If I'm not mistaken, I think Austin Hooper is a free agent as well. So I might be a little bit more of a draft to tight end, but I think, looking at the free agent market would make sense as well. Maybe you can cross off that need before the draft. Offensive tackle, again, agency would only offer really a stopgap. I don't think it would offer kind of a definite long-term fix there. And then the defensive line. I mean, that's where I really, really like, whether you're talking about Jadeveon Clowney or Chris Jones or, I know Yannick Ngakoue maybe isn't the rundown fit guy, but he's still a guy that I think can, give you tremendous presence on third down. And Derek Wolf's been a name thrown around there. I feel like I'm forgetting somebody else on that defensive line that I like. But that's a group that I think in general there are a few names, and there's different tiers of names, and I think that's something that the Colts would be wise to look into, because we know full well there's been times where they've made a move on the first day of free agency, but it's a guy like Danico Autry who maybe isn't, is it like a Malik Collins from Dallas? Is that the sort of name that ends up being, part of a defensive line class? Because I do think you're getting a little bit older up front. So, those are some names that have popped into my head.
Would you resign Jabal Sheard?
I would. Yeah, I would. Now, again, with the caveat of you got to make sure you look into free agency and see if you can upgrade there. But, I think when you look at his rundown presence, and also I know he missed the first few games of the season, but he's been really durable. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Since Chris Ballard came here in 2011, Jabal Sheard has started 11 more games than any other defensive player on the Colts. That's a lot of games in just 3 years. So, I mean, Sheard has done a lot for this franchise in a 3-year span. And again, I go to the rundown presence. Kamoko Turi is not a 3-down player right now. I think he's got a ton of ability on third down, but he's not going to give you much on first or second down right now. And he's coming back from a serious injury. And Ben Banogu, what we saw from him as a rookie is, maybe not quite the definitely not the third down presence that Toure showed this past year, but I don't think you look at him. I mean, you were talking about him being a linebacker at one point, so I don't think you even have a great feel for him on rundowns either. So that's where I look back to first and second down. You look within your division of a Fournette or a Derrick Henry. I mean, those are two teams that want to run the football. That's where I think Sheard's presence can come into play. And then I also think he is a bit of a quiet leader. I think he's been the team's man of the year. I know that the staff really, really respects him as well. So I would probably bring him back on a short-term deal. But still, having said that, even if you do that, you need to fully look into free agency, and maybe it's something where you look into free agency, you see what's out there, and if you find a guy or two and don't feel like you need Sheard anymore, then you go ahead and move on.
Yeah, I mean, you also mentioned, Kevin, it's a two-way street with free agents. It's not like it's not like Madden where the highest number, it's different with the NFL. It's not like you can't just offer the max contract. And, it's like they also want to come and play here. And so that's obviously something to factor in, that even with Devin Funchess, like you mentioned, let's be real, like the reason he signed here, the reason Eric Ebron signed here a couple of years ago was because they wanted to play with Andrew Luck, and now Andrew Luck's no longer here, obviously. So, there's a lot of things, a lot of factors. What is kind of the ideal number of free agents you think you would be satisfied with? The Colts signed 2 last year. I know you mentioned your pod. You'd like to see a few more than that. What's the kind of an ideal number for you that you would like to see the Colts bring in when free agency opens up this spring?
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't really given too much thought to an actual number. When you look at Funchess and you look at Houston, I consider those guys high-level free agents, mainly in terms of price tag. We can obviously debate Devin Funchess' career and where it's been so far, but again, in terms of price tag, mean, he probably received, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm guessing, a top 5 payment in terms of an outside wideout last year. Again, that's high level to me. So if you're talking high level, I would say 3 name that I go with, or the number that I go with. Again, the dominoes with your own free agents will dictate some of that, but I would say, yeah, right around 3. I would say closer to 4 than 2 would be my liking, but for the Colts, and again, just how the dominoes work in free agency, because you bring up a good point, Cody, and the fact of you no longer have the ultimate closer that's Andrew Luck. Like, people want to play with Andrew Luck. It doesn't matter if they're a long snapper or if they're a wideout. They want to play with Andrew Luck. Well, the Colts no longer have that. And, yeah, you can say Ryan Grigson and Chuck Pagano, this and that. Okay, when free agents came in the building, the Colts often, were able to finish off those contracts and able to sign those guys. Well, that's because they had an extremely talented quarterback that was on, his rookie contract, and that's no longer the case. So I think that makes things a little bit difficult as well. And what also makes it difficult is just, the Colts have a clear line that they set on free agents. And when Landon Collins and C.J. Mosley go past that line, they're not willing to break off of that. And that's the debate that I think a lot of fans have of, free agency is a lot of, yes, your B-plus players get A money and C-plus players get B money, but that's just the market. That's just how business works, especially early on in free agency. And so is there a willingness to maybe just loosen that a little bit? Chris Ballard hasn't really shown much of that, but, does a 7-9 season when you brought back 20 or 22 starters, and it was one of the easier schedules, definitely in the AFC South, and I think easier than we thought in general coming into the season. Does that maybe change his philosophy or just alter it? Change is probably too aggressive, but just maybe alter it a little bit.
Absolutely. Last question for you, Kevin. I know he said it was a late night, so you're probably just wanting to get home and take a nap. So you mentioned kind of Chris Ballard kind of talked about this in his, season-ending press conference about the team not being held accountable, like players not holding other players accountable, sitting there at a 5-2 record and kind of getting ahead of themselves a little bit. And he kind of mentioned that as a reason why the team kind of, really had struggled at the end of the year. From what you've heard, you work with the Colts, you're in the complex pretty much every day. What did you kind of take from that press conference from Ballard's words? What do you think was not being held accountable in that locker room for Ballard to say that?
Well, I think when Ballard referenced that, it's the internal accountability of teammate to teammate. You always hear kind of that phrase that coaches love, do we have the player accountability? And that is, again, within the locker room of, okay, I'm Quentin Nelson in the locker room, and I don't feel like Quincy Wilson or someone else is working hard. Do you have the players that, call out is an aggressive term, but not afraid to let that guy know, hey, that's not how we do things, or we need to do it this way, or, we need to meet this sort of standard when it comes to a work ethic or preparation, just in general, a professionalism standpoint. So I think that's where he means it. And it's something that I've talked about before on my podcast. When you talk about local leaders for the Colts, I'm not sure how many that they have. These guys lead in ways, but, in terms of being one of your best players and also being a vocal leader, I just am not sure if like Hilton or Nelson or, Leonard probably to a degree, but I just don't see a lot of like, I don't know, Russell Wilson-esque, sort of like, wow, that guy is very vocal, plays the most important position on the team, and he's going to garner a lot of respect as well. So I think that's what he was getting at a little bit. Now, similar, level of it, when you talk about accountability, I am of the belief, and Chris Ballard would definitely disagree with this, and Frank Reich would as well, that those two lack some accountability with how they handled the Adam Vinatieri situation and just their unwillingness to really make any changes on that kicking unit. Because, yes, Some of those missed kicks were not entirely on Adam Vinatieri's right leg, but you were a historically bad unit, and the refusal to make any changes, there's no accountability there. You're accepting the fact that that level, that consistent poor play, and so I am curious just if you gave that locker room a little bit of true serum, what their thoughts would be on that as well. But I think specifically with Ballard's comments, it's just guys that know that, okay, this is the level of preparation, work ethic, professionalism again, that needs to be practiced daily in order to, meet the sort of lofty standards that this organization has and should have in terms of sustained success.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Kevin, again for joining us. And it'll